This is a very informal conversation, really wanting to, not only start the conversation about what we get to do as podcast creatives, who are also surviving and thriving in our own invisible or visible disabilities, but also how we can prioritize accessibility to our listeners, because we all know that when we don't have a certain experience, there are blind spots for other folks' experiences. And what we want to do is shift that. And if you've been paying attention with even the festival, we're doing what sets us apart, right? We're being intentional about how we include one another. And Brian, I was just talking about the fact that it's time to really kind of fast forward these parts of our lives and our conversations where we are exclusive of one another and get to the point where we're moving forward together. And so, as everybody knows, we have the 415 State of Black podcast. So I'm going to be quiet and we're just going to start conversation. I'm going to let Bri start, and Bri, say whatever it is that comes to you and that you want to talk about with the people that are in the room. And then let's go. Let's share our experiences and talk about what's possible.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for having me, Talib, and thank you so much for creating this amazing festival. I mean, it's just been like 2 days of I just feel so plugged in the community, so that is always a good thing. I'm Bri, host, creator, sound designer, editor, all the things of Power Not Pity. And it's a podcast that interrogates and amplifies the disabled people of color community. So what we do is, we talk shit, we talk about each other, we talk about our lives, we talk shit on able-bodied people. It's great. People say, they really love what the show has to offer and how, we're all just able to connect to each other. So I guess what I wanted to do today is just talk about accessibility and what that can mean for a culture, podcasting culture in general, and what it can mean for all of us. So I gave a talk at the Work It conference. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Work It, but it's a conference for women and non-binary folks in podcasting. And I talked about accessibility there. And just to go really the short story of it, I talked about tangible things and intangible things you can do to increase and encourage accessibility. So, I mean, the tangible things, of course, have to do with captions and transcripts and image descriptions, but the intangible things are also a piece that I want to get at, because, you can have your captions, you can have your transcripts, you can have your image descriptions, but what does it mean to really move the culture forward? What does it mean to actually make sure that your podcast is not only accessible, but the world in which you are influencing is more accessible too? So, I mean, y'all can just drop some questions in the chat or whatever, but the acronym that I use to get people really thinking about it is REAP, REAP. And basically it stands for recognize, educate, amplify, and politicize. And I think those are the steps that we can all take to not only make our podcasts accessible, but also to make the world a more accessible place, right? Because we don't live in a vacuum, we all move together. And I think, when you're thinking about the ways in which you can make the world a better place, it's all about learning and then doing, because if you know better, you do better, right? At least I hope. So yeah, I see your thumbs up, Talib. Thank you. So yeah, for the first part of the presentation, I talked about the idea of just being willing to actually say something like, hey, you know, this doesn't include such and such, or this doesn't include a certain person, or maybe there's a voice that's missing in the space. So something that I want to encourage people is to recognize that and then educate themselves on what it is exactly that's missing. And then after you're done learning all that thing, you know, learning all the things that you need to know, I think the next step of making your podcast more accessible is to actually amplify and to pass the mic to other people who may not be in the room. I think something that I learned actually from a previous panel was that the previous panel about amplifying queer voices in podcasting, it's basically like, you know, you got to bring your full self, you know, you got to bring your full self, you got to move in the ways that feel authentic to you. And I just think in the same kind of vein, amplifying is about allowing someone else to do that same thing. And, you know, the last letter of the acronym P is about politics and politicizing what it is that you have to say. I think the personal is political. I'm a feminist, and I really do believe that whatever it is you're putting out there with your podcast, whatever kind of views that you have that you want to express, the art that you're creating, it's not just like one piece, right? It moves in a whole culture of pieces. And what you have to say, honestly, someone said this to me at one point in my podcast journey, and I was just like, my mind was blown, right? They basically said, what you are doing right now is documenting history, documenting disability history. And I couldn't believe it, because I was like, I'm just putting out episodes. Like, I'm not doing no big thing, you know, but it's true. All of us, whatever we're doing, whatever your podcast is about, you are documenting history, you are documenting culture, and don't take that lightly, you know? And I think when you're thinking about politicizing, it's not just like adding your politics into it. It's also about how you kind of influence the world too. So what I say? I'd say when you're thinking about politicizing, you're thinking about, you know, taking the next step. It's about being accountable. You know, it's also about being accountable not only to your audience, but to yourself, knowing that you have all the tools behind you. You are recognizing, you've educated yourself. Maybe you've included some disabled folks on your show, talked about a disability issue, and then, you know, you take the last step, and it's like a whole other way of being, you know, like you've moved from one point in the journey to another point that is just completely different from where you were at the beginning. So I think when we're talking about accessibility, it's a process, you know, it's a process, but it's a beautiful process. And I've learned so much on my own journey. Yeah. Are there any questions or anything? I can't see the chat.
Yeah.
Let me see.
I don't think so. And again, because I'm not good at this, my wife said make her a co-host and she can help me. But
there aren't any questions in the chat.
There aren't.
Okay.
Okay, but please, you know, and I'm gonna single out my friend, one of my best friend, Jeannie, and who's doing a podcast right now specifically for advocacy, right? For disabled you know, youth, young people. And so I want you to, you know, what are their thoughts around, even when we think about even your podcast, right? I sound engineered it. Were we considering, you know, did we consider folks with disability while we're talking about disability, you know, and those things in which prioritizing getting this information and understanding these blind spots are so important, you know what I mean? You can unmute yourself
Definitely.
and talk to us. Unmute. Yeah, there we go.
That's like facts. I was just realizing that we did not. Well, ironically enough, when I do my SEO and I do my pictures, I do my website, it is accessible.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The whole conversation of captions and transcripts has just become a general conversation because people tend to read instead of listen and vice versa. But
Mhm.
one of the things that I wanted to do with my show this season, but hopefully next season, was to actually have adults on my show with disabilities to give voice to their childhood experiences.
Mm.
And you reminded
That's
me of that
dope.
a minute
That's
ago.
dope. I
Yeah.
don't really know of any podcast out there that talks about disability, first of all, that focuses on like the adult, the child perspective of a disabled adult. So I'm like, that's gonna be really good conversations.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Just because I think as adults, if your parent doesn't have disability, you let someone else tell you what that disability is in your child.
Mm-hmm.
And then that influences how you treat them and how you act with them. Right.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
definitely.
our podcast is dedicated to bring out the voice of the experience to make it real time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just in like the effort of being mindful of time, I'm wondering, Talib, if I can like send out. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I don't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to throw in a quick question. I guess one of the questions I had was about education, and I guess it was about how can we best educate ourselves about this. But I think I can figure that out on my own. I think I could I can Google, I can listen to your podcast and similar other podcasts. I think
Yeah,
the
but I'm
things
right
that
here with you, so let's
yes.
talk.
So one of the questions I had was about I'm very concerned about not wanting to feel like I'm tokenizing. So if I were to invite a disabled person to come on my podcast, we would be geeking out about sewing. Like that is what we would be doing. And I wouldn't want to feel like, unless a person volunteered, like if they were a wheelchair user and how they use a sewing machine, it's like, oh, I just use, I have this hand control that I can do. And, all of these things. I just I wouldn't want anyone to feel like I'm bringing them on. I'm just super sensitive about treating somebody the way that white folks sometimes treat me or other Black people. And I'm like, I just do not want to reproduce that in any way. I want to do whatever I can to learn all I can so that I can reach somebody in community. That's I don't know. That's just one of the things I was really struggling with.
Right, I'm gonna jump
Okay.
in really quick.
That yeah.
What just saying, it starts with that intention, right? Your intention is not to, so your energy more often than not will express that. And so if you're what we've learned about white folk is that they're grossly unaware of themselves, right? Like grossly. And I think one of the things that's going to matter, and I want Bri to jump back in because we do only have a few minutes, but is that intention and that energy, and somebody can tell, like really can tell if you're coming at it with that intention of tokenizing or unawareness of tokenizing, just trying to do something to elevate yourself or something, versus you coming correct and or coming with that well intention. And so, Bri, go for it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, intention is so important. This is something I actually talked about in the presentation. And if you'll allow me, Talib, to just write up a little document of resources that people could use, I think
Absolutely.
that would be awesome if you could send that out in like an
It's gonna go
email
out
to everyone.
That's
But
great.
thank you. Something that I talked about in that presentation was the idea of intention versus impact. And I think that, white people are often well-intentioned, but their impact does not land. And I mean, you have the intention there, And I think the fact that you are even thinking of including disabled people on your podcast is already like beautiful from the jump, right? Because people don't even involve disabled people in anything really. Like,
there's a sewing lady that I know, and she's legally blind, and she makes gorgeous
exactly
stuff. It takes her longer than it takes me, but her sewing is gorgeous. And so, you know, that I think that's
I mean, just like one quick thing. I also want you to consider that in including a disabled person onto your show, you're not only involving them, you're amplifying them, and you know, it looks good on you because you're making the effort to include everyone, and that makes the world more accessible in, you know, by proxy. I think just the fact that you're asking this person on the show, their disability, their disabled experience will come through because it's their lived experience, right? Like, you may not ask that woman on the show, like, how do you do such and such, or like, you know, like, what is the world like for you as a blind sewer? But it's gonna come through anyway because she's blind and she's gonna talk from her experience, right? So I think, you know, like, part of the piece of amplifying folks is just letting them do their thing, you know? Like, you have the platform, and so you put us on, and it just makes for a better podcast altogether, you know? So I have no worries that you'd be tokenizing anyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Bri, we thank you for this opportunity to, you know, again, you know what I said to you. We're just beginning, we're just starting. I appreciate that resource to send out to everyone. And this is just the start of not only the conversation, but our movement, you know, our impact, like you said. And so just stay tuned, stay connected, and we're gonna get there together. Or not at all. All right. All right. So we have our next session, State of Black podcast, coming up, and can't wait to see y'all there. Thank you, Brian. Brian, drop your information in there, Power Not Pity podcast, so that everybody can follow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. At Power Not Pity on Instagram. And and everything goes from there. I can't find the chat. I don't know what's happening, but
I'm having a hard time too. But it's
all
just
good.
www.powernotpity.com.
Yeah, and we also on our YouTube, there's an interview between. Well, I got to do that, but there'll be an interview, and on our IG Live, there's an interview with Brian and I from last week. So thank you all, and we'll see you at State of Black Podcast.
Can we get an Ussie before we go?
Sure, let's get us an Ussie.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. I got you anyway, Latifah.
All right. Later, y'all. Peace.